There's a story of a nurse who escorted late one night a tired and anxious young man to the bedside of an elderly patient. The nurse whispered into the dying man's ear, "Your son is here." She had to repeat it several times before his eyes had opened, for he was heavily sedated. But he could barely see the young man standing by his side. The old man simply reached out his hand, and the young man wrapped his fingers around it, squeezing them with tenderness and assurance. The nurse brought a chair for the young man to be seated, and for the rest of the night, he sat by the old man's bed, holding his hand and gently stroking his forehead. Throughout those hours, the old man said nothing. As dawn broke, the old man's earthly life came to an end. The young man, when he realized it, gently released the lifeless hand he had been holding all night, wiped tears from his eyes and cheek, and went to notify the nurse. The young man waited until the nurse had completed all the necessary tasks to confirm his death. And as the nurse began to offer the young man her condolences, he quickly interrupted her, and he asked her, "Who was that man?" The nurse looked startled and surprised. She said to him, "I thought you were his son." The young man shook his head and said, "No, he wasn't. I never saw him before last night." The nurse turned beet red in embarrassment. She was puzzled and asked the young man, "Why didn't you say something to me when I took you to his room and to him?" The young man replied, "I knew he needed someone. He needed his son. And obviously, he wasn't going to be there. My own father just died a few doors down, and I understand what he and his son are going through, and I knew that I had to be there." The young man went on and said, "When I realized that he was too sick to tell whether or not I was his son, I knew how much he needed me in those last few hours." What a powerful testimony of the gift of love of this young man, willing to reach out and to hold a stranger's hand in his last hours of life. I think in many ways, this young man becomes a living example of what Jesus is speaking about this evening in our gospel, when he both asks and then answers the question, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And what is Jesus' response? Jesus simply responds to his own question. Whoever does the will of God is brother and sister and mother. At first, we may be surprised and startled at Jesus' response. Does he not know who his own mother is, Mary? Does he not know who his own cousins are? Certainly he did. But Jesus, in fact, was not downgrading these relationships, but he was elevating these relationships with his mother and his cousins, but also to each and every person who is obedient and faithful to doing God's will in their lives. As such, it is a clear reminder that we are, in fact, brothers and sisters to one another, and how, like Jesus throughout his earthly ministry, and the young man that night by the hospital bed, are called to be able to do good for one another, not only for our family and friends, not only for those that we know and like, but even at times to the strangers that we encounter in the midst of life journey, that we are called to reach out and to support one another in the midst of our joys and our sorrows, in our blessings and our challenges. And we will be reminded of that same reality in the words of the Eucharistic prayer that we will hear this night. Tonight I will be praying the fourth Eucharistic prayer for various needs. And I've always been struck by the title the Church gives to this Eucharistic prayer. She says the title to this Eucharistic prayer is Jesus who went about doing good. Jesus who went about doing good. Certainly we know that as we read the Gospels throughout Jesus' public ministry, day in and day out, Jesus went about doing good. He reached out to the sick and the suffering, to the poor and to those in need. He extended his hand in mercy and forgiveness to all who came to him. And as such, Jesus was able to recognize in each and every person that they were a brother and sister to him, and that he had an obligation to be able to respond in mercy, in compassion, in generosity. In fact, our preface this evening, we are reminded how Jesus always had compassion for children and the poor, for the sick and for sinners, and he became a neighbor to the oppressed and the afflicted. But not only was Jesus able to do this during his earthly life and ministry, but as the Eucharistic prayer will go on this evening, we then are reminded as baptized members of the Church, disciples of Jesus, of how it is that we are called to follow in his footsteps. And how is it that we are called to follow in the footsteps of Jesus who went about doing good? Our Eucharistic prayer will remind us with these words: open our eyes to the needs of our brothers and sisters. Inspire in us words and actions to comfort those who labor and are burdened. Make us serve them truly after the example of Christ and at his command. And may your Church stand as a living witness. This is how we follow in the footsteps of Jesus, who went about doing good. It begins with us having our eyes open to be able to see the need, the misery, the compassion that we are to look upon those that we encounter. And then as our eyes are open, as we realize the need that is there, then we are called to be inspired, not only with words that can often be cheap and contrite, but moreover by actions, to be able to comfort those who labor and are burdened. And when we do so, then we truly become more and more who Jesus calls us to be, for we are following his command to be able to serve one another and to love without counting the cost. This is what the young man did that night in the hospital, holding the hand of son unknown dying father. And this is what we are called to do moment by moment, day by day. We are called to be the presence of Christ to one another and to be able to do good for those that we encounter. As we gather this evening to celebrate our Eucharist, as we resume this season of ordinary time, having the opportunity over these next weeks and months to walk in the footsteps of Jesus and the apostles, learning from his day-to-day ministry, he will continue to reveal to us how it is that he went about doing good, so that we too might learn and relearn those lessons, and then to be able to apply them in our daily lives. But we recognize that to have our eyes open to see the needs of others, to be able to be moved with compassion and love, is not an easy task. And it is for this reason that we come week after week to celebrate the holy sacrifice of the Mass. For in and through the gift of the Mass, we are nourished and strengthened by our God in his word, and in a few moments in his body and blood given to us for the life of the world, so that strengthened and nourished, we might be empowered to be his living presence day in and day out. And so the challenge as we receive the Eucharist this evening and each time we come to Mass is to be able to pray for that grace, to have our eyes, our ears, our hearts open, to see what is happening in our midst, and then to be able to have the courage to be able to do whatever it is that the Lord asks. Open our eyes to the needs of our brothers and sisters. Inspire in us words and actions to comfort those who labor and are burdened. Make us serve them truly after the example of Christ and at his command. And may your church stand as a living witness.